Welcome everyone, thanks for joining us from across the UK and around the world. My name is Alan Miller, I'm co-founder of the Together Association, and we're really excited to be in Leeds this evening. Make some noise, Leeds! I'm really excited to be here. Leeds is one of my favourite cities, and just as we start, often we have placards, but tonight we're holding up something very important, because the way we carry on doing the work we do, our campaigning, our lobbying, what we call our 360 approach, press, grassroots on the ground, local regional hubs, is through our membership scheme. Now just put your hands up if you're a member, please. Right, big round of applause to the members in the audience. Thank you very much, well done. You're the ones that keep us going. And if you're not a member, please join us tonight. We've got Cara and Shirley and all the guys, Rose, and everyone at the back, and Danny, that are going to be there to help. If you want to join us, we'd really appreciate it. And so what we plan on doing in Britain is getting the public engaged and involved and having our voices heard. We're not interested in being smeared or censored and shut down, but this evening we're going to have a live debate that is going to be an open debate, transparent. We have invited councillors, local councillors and MPs. Unfortunately, unless I'm wrong, is there a councillor in the room? There was one who said they might come, but none of them have taken us up on the offer. But we're very, very passionate about getting everyday people, the great British people, the backbone of society, to have a discussion and reflect on where we're at and on making a difference. Because in the last few years, at Together, we've managed to change policy, we've managed to get things done, everything from the vaccine mandate right through to low traffic neighbourhood funding with active travel, the Department of Transport, an inquiry by the former Prime Minister into these measures. Now we know inquiries, there's inquiries and inquiries. Obviously the so-called lockdown inquiry isn't even assessing lockdowns. But nevertheless, work that people do in local, regional, national activities and campaigning is really important. And we say we're going to take back democracy. And what we're going to do, everyone? Take back democracy. And how are we going to do that? Together. We're going to do it together. And as I was saying, Leeds is one of my favourite cities. Many years ago, I used to come to Back to Basics here that Dave Beer ran, and it was all about hospitality and events, and people would come from across the country. It was very exciting. But historically, Leeds has been very important. A bit of a late starter, so not you know, it's later, but come the 17th century and the 18th century, really important, the Industrial Revolution. And here's a few takeaways just to remember, because even in this hotel that's been here from the 1800s, this area has been important for the Enlightenment, for productivity, for growth, and for development. The father of civil engineering, in fact, John Smeaton, was born in Orsthorpe, Leeds, in 1724. He was a civil engineer that designed bridges, canals, harbours and lighthouses. We don't seem to be able to do that as much these days for some reason. How did we go from a city and a nation of innovators, canal builders, bridge, car, flight developers, to one of the flawed bollards on roads as trialled in Leeds in the 2020? I mean, Hyde Park, low traffic neighbourhoods, or as they're known here, active travel neighbourhoods, shut down. They were challenged and taken out, but we've seen them in Beeston, Chapeltown, Allerton, Lincoln Green and other areas. In fact, the charity Possible group says that they want to have a car-free vision in a fair city, which means take a bike. Remember you people used to mock Norman Tebbit when he used to say, get on your bike and cycle down to get a job. Well, as it happens, the idea now that what you should do if you want to get around and have free mobility is walk or get a bike is completely contemptible and really disdainful of working people, delivery people, women, a range of families, basically everyone. We never sort of signed that away. And the conversation tonight is about debanking, and it is about digital ID. And it's about how all these things are linked together. Now, a quick thing. We're very frustrated this evening because the delivery couldn't get here because of the bus gates and the cycle lanes, which are empty. And this so-called zero word that keeps being used, but Vision Zero that Leeds Council has got. Remember, Leeds Council that is in a partnership with UK 100. You may not have heard of them, but no one's voted for them. But it seems that our local authorities are being hijacked by green billionaires like Christopher Hone and Mike Bloomberg and Bill Gates, who are funding people like UK 100 who pretend to be a grassroots organisation but actually massively funded. They always talk about big oil, massively funded, but these are the kind of organisations that are stifling, suffocating our streets with surveillance and bollards and with a discussion about pay per mile for electric vehicles as well, as it happens now, as we've seen with Sadiq Khan, all of which would be much nicer and easier to do if you've got a digital ID, a bit of a programmable currency, and you can have things taken out when you go over your limit or in the wrong zone. Now we should remember it was Tony Blair. Tony Blair who was, you know, he's basically, yeah, well, Tony Blair, I mean, he's very, very influential, and the Tony Blair Institute is very influential. You may have thought that someone who's been somewhat disgraced as a Prime Minister for his role, particularly internationally, you know, things can only get better, I don't think, would then go away and maybe just make a bit of money and be quiet. But he's come to have enormous influence. Now, it is true that the current government has said we're not having digital IDs, but we remember that with Boris Johnson and with the previous government, don't we? They said, no, we're not going to have it, and that's how Together was born. On Freedom Day, when Boris Johnson said, we've got Freedom Day now, everyone, and by the way, we're going to have vaccine passports. And we had thousands of hospitality venues saying we wouldn't have a papers, please society, but that's when we got together with many more people around the country, campaigners, people of faith, business people in different sectors and citizens, and said we weren't going to have it. We've got a little video that Steve's going to play that just introduces the theme, and then I'll say a couple more words. Yes, please.
It's an obvious thing to move in the direction of digital ID because it's an enabler for people, not just, by the way, in relation to COVID-19 and coronavirus. It's a huge enabler in respect of interaction with government.
That it goes across the party lines, and so that even through changes of government, you're still in the same direction with the same ambition.
We're planning to make full vaccination the condition of entry to nightclubs and other venues. Proof of a negative test will no longer be enough.
This would put a permanent marker on the devastating change in the relationship between the state and the citizens. The state is here to protect us only where it is proportionate and necessary.
An egregious overreach on the part of the government, that they are indeed dangerous in terms of what they open the door for, that they are divisive, because they will create a two-tier society.
Together declaration, I've actually signed it. I want everyone in the public to sign as well. We can have our voices heard. We're stronger together, we're better together. Yeah, the Tony Blair Institute saying, well, if you want to deal with immigration, it's not about getting control of the Home Office, it's not about borders and having a rigorous strategy. No, it's about digital ID. Everything gets back to digital ID with Tony Blair, and we can see Keir Starmer is a big fan of his. It's really important that we understand that the question of digital IDs that are mandatory is like a principle on everything on free speech. We either have free speech or we don't. We don't start saying, oh, if you have free speech for these people, then we can curb it because we don't like it. The fact that immigration now is being used as the attempt to bring in digital ID mandatory for everyone should remind us that it's a principle that we need to be concerned about, that the state having programmable central bank digital currency and be able to deplatform or debank people like we've seen already happen with private institutions as a consequence of their EDI and ESG rules and directives should be chilling to the bone to everyone. We should not have mandatory digital ID, not because of immigration or any other issue. There's plenty of ways to deal with things, a robust Home Office, an attempt to make sure that civil servants and all others do their jobs properly, a recognition that you've got the citizens on board with your whole approach, and a wider policy about what we're doing across the UK where the citizens are engaged with that, like banning certain marches and actual speech. It's the regressive way of dealing with things. So that's why we're here all to discuss about digital ID and remind everyone that, you know, around these key issues, we shouldn't go along with it. So I'm just going to take a photo of you all. You all look fantastic. There we go. So we've seen, thank you, Steve, that a range of people say, well, are you just being a bit nervous about what might happen? Well, tonight we've got speakers that are going to talk about the political and practical ramifications of questions around debanking and financial control of a social credit system in China and what that might mean here. We've just seen in a borough that they've said that they're going to have a digital dustbin that you have to access at a certain time, and if you do it in the wrong way, you're going to get automatically fined. We know we're seeing these things with parking zones, with limits and restrictions, but it's not just nudge, and it's not just impositions, it's not just lock you down and you can only come out for 1 hour. It's also take away your freedom in society, to debank you, to deplatform you. And it's not just a fear, of course, because we've seen it happen already. We campaigned with UsForThem, the great mothers who've campaigned for our children, with the Free Speech Union and many others who were being deplatformed by PayPal and others for having the wrong kind of view. So basically, we're never quite sure what it is. It's this kind of set of ideas that you're not allowed to ask questions around the environment, around lockdowns, around gender-based rights, that if you don't have the right kind of attitude, you could run the risk of being cancelled financially, like those old movies, you know, where they cancel your credit card and everywhere you try and go, you can't do anything. That takes away our freedom, as well as cancelling us in our jobs, not having the discussion. Not having a mob trying to get you to lose your job and lose your livelihood, but not having a discussion about the merits or the virtues of something. It isn't just PayPal. Of course, we've seen Eventbrite, we've seen comedy shows pulled off, we've seen Riley Gaines, who was taken down from Eventbrite for allegedly anti-hate legislation, basically for saying that a man who's a cheat, who's swimming, should not be doing that. And that allegedly is anti-hate. So the whole hate crime, hate speech discussion comes into this. Diversity, equality and inclusion is a big part of this discussion. ESG, environmental, societal and governance, used to be corporate social responsibility. Let's try and have a good impact on things. Now, both in the private sphere and in the public sector, these are key directives. And as we've seen, a very, very high-profile case with NatWest and Coots, with Nigel Farage. Now, if Nigel Farage can be debanked and deplatformed, anyone can. Now, he was able to make a big fuss. We all then campaigned, we all then wrote in, we all then got the government to say we're not happy with this, the Financial Control Authority, and they agreed to change legislation to make sure it was enshrined that we could have legal free speech. That was all going through. And then the snap election meant that it's lapsed and it has not gone through. So that's something that we need to focus on really hard. And hundreds of years after the Enlightenment, after the Constitution, after William Tyndale and many that gave their lives, burnt at the stake, gave their lives for us to be able to speak freely, to say the unsayable, to be a heretic in this new world, not that criticises the church or the monarch, but that criticises new holy grails, like the environmental catastrophe. If you don't say that's what it is, or if you say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman and that can't change, or if you say, actually lockdowns, we don't think that's the right way to go about it, can we not look at perhaps doing it another way? You're then a denier, or you're a danger to society, you're not keeping people safe, and then you run the risk of being deplatformed and debanked. We also lobbied really hard to have cash with the Bank of England, also to have cash points and to make sure we have that, and we're going to continue to do that. It's not to obsess about one type of fiat currency over another. We will hear from people tonight about blockchain and Bitcoin options, and we've got Cameron Parry who's going to talk about tally money later. All very interesting, exciting developments. But the key question is, who's deciding when all this surveillance is going on? Who's making decisions and on what basis about what we can and can't say? Is that what we want in a free society? Or are we adults that should be able to make judgments based on our own decision making? Not having spy units, as we've seen with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, or the Rapid Response Unit, or the Disinformation Unit, the Counter-Disinformation Unit, still in existence. Or even with people like Mariana Spring from the state broadcaster that think some things are disinformation and misinformation, but others are not. And Demos, that had the completely preposterous accused together of being at the vanguard of disinformation, and we've asked them to have a debate with us and address this. They're not prepared to. And you see, this is what happens now. People don't want to thrash out the discussion and the debate, because no one really wants to say, I don't want you having free speech. The Online Safety Act, the government doesn't want to say, we're going to stop you speaking. What they want to do is outsource it to big tech. But we are going to keep campaigning and making sure that we have the debates and discussions. And I would invite anyone that disagrees with some of these things tonight to make your voice heard as well. It's really important that we speak to people that we don't agree with in a civil fashion. We're not going to have heckling here because we're all grown up. We're going to be able to say exactly what we want. And we're not going to ban or censor anyone, but we are going to do it in a civil, grown-up way. Without further ado, I'm just going to introduce our speakers. I'm really excited tonight because we've got fantastic speakers. And let's give them an applause at the end, not for each one, and we'll get right into the discussion. We're basically, the way the format's going to work is, I'll shut up in a minute, which you'll all be relieved about. And then we're going to hear from the speakers. It's going to be about 7 minutes each. And then I'm going to ask a couple of questions about what they said. Then we're going to come out to you guys. And Shirley and Paul are going to be at the front. Paul from Leeds Salon, that does really great work. You should check it out as well as the Together meetings. And you can line up and you can ask questions and make points, and we're going to get through everyone. And then we're also going to have a drink at the end and socialise and all that. So we'll have plenty of time to chat. So first of all, directly next to me is Tamanda Harkness. She's a radio presenter, a lapsed comedian. That's in her words, not mine. She's also an author of Big Data, Does Size Matter? And her latest book, Technology is Not the Problem, which I'd really recommend you guys to get. I'm always interested to hear Tamanda speak, particularly when we sort of end up fetishizing technology a bit and saying it could be a bit technophobic or technophiliac. But, you know, what does it mean in a human way and about what we're doing and what are the questions around it? Then we have Dr. David McGrogan, who's the Associate Professor of Law at Northumbria Law School. David writes on topics including human rights, law, cashless society, debanking, and much more. And you'll know David from his articles at the Daily Skeptic. He has a Substack where you can read his latest articles under the title, The Tyrannical Tendency. So thank you for being with us, David. Next to David is Reverend Richard Fothergill, who many of you will recognise. He was debanked last year by Yorkshire Building Society after being with them for 17 years and after replying to a request for feedback with a very polite email objecting to the Building Society's promotion of transgender ideology. And that, you know, transgender ideology, not transgender people, is very important that we recognise that. And he received a reply telling him that his views were not tolerable and that his account would be closed. Chilling to the bone, right? So thank you for joining us this evening. And finally, we have Austin Williams, who has actually just been in China recently. And he's the director of the Future Cities Project. He's an honorary research fellow, and I'm going to say the letters because I can't say it, but XJTLU, Suzhou, China, and also the author of China's Urban Revolution. And Austin will be sharing insights about China's social credit system, myth versus reality, and also Austin writes a lot and speaks about urban planning, development, cities, the future, what it can look like. And I really think in an age where we're in a kind of fearful, therapeutic, petrified moment where we're all at risk, it's always good to step back and think about what we think about the future and what the city's meant to mean, particularly when we're seeing the sorts of things we've seen this evening in Leeds and we see up and down the country with these limits and cameras and bollards. So please give a big round of applause to our speakers. It's like one of those smorgasbords where you help yourself. So, David, I'm going to ask if you could start, please. Thank you. You can, yeah.
Hello, everybody. I had a short speech prepared for today, this evening, that I was going to deliver, but on the drive down here, I sort of reflected on things and thought I could say a few simple, or give a few simple remarks, I suppose, that can tie together quite a few of what the other speakers will be discussing, so I'll just do that very briefly. So I want to draw your attention to a word that we don't often use in daily life and which we don't really think very hard about. And that word is discretion. So what I want to ask you today is a series of questions about discretion. What does it mean when we say that somebody exercises discretion? What does it mean to say that we give the power to somebody to exercise their discretion? And what does it mean to be the subject of discretionary power? How does that feel, and what are the consequences of being subject to discretion? The reason why I asked that, and the reason why I raised that series of questions, is because the future that's unfolding in front of us is one in which discretionary power is becoming much more prevalent than at any time in human history. The reason why that's happening is because technology is advancing the scope for discretionary power by the state and its decision makers. I'll give you 3 brief examples of legislation that already exists and legislation that will come into effect within the next, I would say, the next Parliament, certainly the next 4 or 5 years. So the first piece of legislation is something called the Proceeds of Crime Act. You might have heard of the Proceeds of Crime Act if you're involved in banking or in the finance industry. The Proceeds of Crime Act is the basic anti-money laundering legal framework within the United Kingdom. The Proceeds of Crime Act allow enforcement authorities, the Financial Conduct Authority, HMRC, etc., to do a wide variety of things. But to put the word debanking into perspective, the Financial Conduct Authority, the HMRC, have the power to freeze bank accounts for up to 2 years. That means no money can be paid in or out, or transferred in or out, for 2 years with an account freezing order. And if an account is frozen, they can also then get an order from a magistrate to forfeit all of the funds in the account. Right? And that's been a power that has existed since 2002. Completely down to the discretion of the enforcement authorities. In order to get an account freezing order or an account forfeiture order, all that the enforcement authority needs to do is to convince a magistrate that they have reasonable grounds for suspecting that funds in the account are intended for use in relation to unlawful activity. So they don't need to prove a crime, they don't need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that they have suspicions, they need to have reasonable grounds for suspecting that the funds might be used in connection with a criminal offence in the future, right? And not by the owner of the bank account. The funds could be intended for use in criminal conduct by anybody, right? The second piece of legislation is a statute that came onto the books last year in 2023, the Energy Act 2023. So the Energy Act 2023 is an absolute behemoth in length. So, you know, I'm speaking about one small element of the legislation. But the Energy Act 2023 creates essentially the legislative framework for the regulation of energy into individual households. So what the Energy Act 2023 does is it provides the power to the Secretary of State, meaning a government minister, to set up a regulatory body which will have the power to determine the energy flows into household appliances and the power to require all households to have what's called an energy smart device or energy smart devices, meaning dishwashers, fridges, and so forth, into which the flow of electricity can be remotely regulated through the internet, right? At pain of criminal sanction. The third piece of legislation is not yet in existence, even in draft form, but will come into effect, no doubt, within the next Parliament, I would say. And that is a piece of legislation regulating the use of digital currencies, and particularly what's bound to be called the digital pound, which is a project by the Bank of England and HM Treasury to create a central bank digital currency for the United Kingdom. So the Bank of England and HM Treasury have made clear that if a central bank digital currency does come into effect in the UK, and they are determined that it will, then it will be programmable. That means that it can be programmed to expire within a certain time frame. It could be expired to lose its value over a certain time frame. It can be programmed to be spent at certain locations and not others, or it can be programmed to only purchase certain items and not others. Right? So that piece of legislation will no doubt come into effect within the next period. So to go back to discretion, we are now entering an era in which we are more reliant than ever before on the character of decision makers, because decision makers have such power. The way that technology has developed has given the state and its officials extraordinary potential power to govern the lives of the population in a manner that was not conceivable even 20 years ago, right, let alone 100 years ago. So we have to start asking a series of questions about discretion. Who do we want to grant the power of discretion to in exercising the newfound power that the state has? What kind of person do we want to put in a position of authority over us? And that raises further questions about the education, about the ideology, about the character of our rulers. So we're entering into a phase of, I think most people would intuit, a phase of kind of technocratic managerial government. We all, of course, are familiar with that. But we should not allow ourselves to fall into the trap of thinking that that mode of government is impersonal, it's faceless, it's a kind of systemic thing that's opaque, that's lacking in transparency, that we can't get to grips with. In actual fact, the further technology develops, the more we need to grasp at the question of the character of the people who are put into positions of power. I'm not very optimistic about the future when I look at the character of our current crop of decision makers, but we very urgently need to start addressing that question. Who do we want to give the power of discretion to? So that's the point at which I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Some very good things for us to reflect on discretion there. Richard.
Do you
want to swap it? No.
Great pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you for inviting me over from Cumbria, where I'm living. I'm just really going to share my sort of first thought. You can't hear.
And can someone ask for Nathan to be here, please?
Cara.
Is that better? Yeah, that's much better, isn't it? Hi, I'm Richard Fothergill. A great pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you for inviting me over from Cumbria, where we live. I'm just really going to share my first-hand experience of debanking, which happened almost exactly this time last year. It was the first weekend in July, actually, last year. And it was dealing with the Yorkshire Building Society. Now, I've been a member, I've had a savings account with them for 17 years. And before that, my father, my parents, my late father had several accounts with them. I'm part Yorkshire, and as the family, almost a family tradition, we'd had some dealings with the Yorkshire Building Society. Anyway, so every member of the Building Society, every month, we would get an email from head office saying, how are we doing as a bank? We want to hear from you, our members. Are we doing the things you want us to do? This kind of stuff. And of course, you put those in the junk media file, don't you? But on this one occasion, in June last year, they were pushing very heavily LGBTQA, whatever the numbers are now, month of June. And they say, how are we doing? And the masthead was covered in transsexual flags. And I just thought, well, they are asking. Oh, I might give them a reply. That was probably foolish, I've now discovered. Anyway, I wrote back to them a polite letter on their portal, polite email, stating two things. The first thing was, you're a good bank. You're good at managing money. But you're obviously spending a great deal of energy and time and money and personnel on pushing this social agenda. Don't do it. Use your resources to do what you're designed for, which is to bank, manage money. And then the second point, I said, as a minister in the church, I have severe reservations about the transsexual ideology. Again, I didn't have a go at anybody, and I didn't mention anybody by name. It was a politely written message back to them. But I referenced the hoo-ha that had been taking place the year before, 9 months before, with Drag Queen Story Hour, which some of you may be familiar with, when various drag queens were going into libraries and schools and reading stories to underage children, and the parents were getting upset about it. And I actually referenced that with a link to actually The Guardian and the Mail as far as their coverage of that drag queen story hour, and saying basically this is an ideological thing, and it's, you shouldn't be pushing this on us as if it was a fact and a good thing for society. Anyway, so I wrote these two short paragraphs, and I thought the best that could happen is if 100 other people responded like me, then maybe in 2024, they would just sit easy. The marketing department might say to them, look, let's not push that LGBTQ stuff. There was a bit of a pushback against it. I thought that was the best result that might happen. I thought almost certainly they'll just ignore me, because that's kind of what marketing departments do, isn't it, when they don't hear something they don't like. Well, I was quite surprised. 2 weeks later, I got a very sharp letter back from them, a physical letter, in which they said things like, it's clear between the two of us that our relationship is irrevocably broken down, which was absolute news to me. And I thought, oh, no, I'm just replying to your question. And then things like, we must protect our staff from prejudice, which presumably meant me, protect my staff from you, Richard Fothergill. We're going to close your account in 2 weeks' time. If you don't take the money out, we'll send you the check of what's in there. Now, there wasn't much in there. It's only a savings account, not a current account. Anyway, so I sat on this letter for 24 hours, and actually I prayed about it, and I felt that it was right to stand up and say, no, this is not the way to behave. I thought that if nothing else, that maybe the next guy in line maybe has a current account with them, and it's their business, and he said something they don't approve of, and they cancel him in 2 weeks' notice. And that would have shipwrecked people with a current account rather than a savings account. I had a current account elsewhere, so in one sense it wasn't really too prejudicial. But the principle is the key thing. And I really felt, as a Christian, you see, as Christians, we believe in freedom. Freedom matters. It says in the Bible, in Galatians 5:1, it says, for freedom's sake, Christ Jesus has set you free. It's actually a principle of God that freedom is something he honors humanity with. It's something he gives us as people. Well, thank you. And so freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, these things are actually fundamental to our humanity. And it is demonstrated in the fact that God himself has allowed us to have the freedom to say, no, I don't want a relationship with you. Or yes, I do want a relationship with you, So faith matters. So for that reason, I basically stood up. And I thought also I may have the contacts that other people don't have to start trying to get a bit of reaction about this. So I'm a member of the Free Speech Union, which I'm sure many of you have heard of or are members of. I rang them up, and I had a chat with a case officer there called Fraser, who's very helpful. And I sent him my original response to them, and I sent a copy of the letter they sent me. And I rang him up, and I said, Fraser, have I done something wrong here? Have I tripped on something I don't know about? And he said, no, almost certainly, it's a test case. You can sue the pants off these guys, because they've broken the law in two ways. They should have given you 60 days notice, and they haven't in any way described your crime in specific terms. They haven't said what you've done wrong. They've just thrown back at you a broad slander, essentially, which is that we want to protect our staff from views like this, because this is nasty, Anyway, so I said, well, what should we do? And he then put me on to a journalist at the Times, and I had a long interview with him. And he printed that on the first Saturday in July, as I say. Now, it just happened, the timing of it, that it was the same day that Nigel Farage's debanking story hit the press. So there's old Nigel on the top of the page, on page 3, and right on the bottom, there's me, vicar from the north, getting debanked. And I was very much the little man. If they can have a go at vicars, nobody is safe, kind of idea. So and then I used to work in the press before I went into the church many years ago, and I know a little bit how they work, and they all watch each other. So that became the story. And that evening, actually, I was got on to GB News as well. I had an interview with Calvin Robinson, who some of you may know, before he got sacked from GB News. And the story took off, and I had a lot of media interest in the whole thing. And it was interesting, I had over 200 bits of correspondence came to me over the next few weeks. All except 2 were saying, we 100% agree with you. What you're doing is right. The principle is right. They're a bank. They should do banking. It's not for them to try and do social engineering and basically say, I'm not going to have your customer because I don't like the look of you politically or religiously or whatever. That's not their job. They've got, and I ended up actually having an interview last summer as well with on Planet Normal with Liam Halligan and Alison as well. And obviously Liam is a business correspondent, and again we talked about it on the financial side about how banks, they're basically given a license to bank, and it's a license to print money. It's not for them to get involved with these cultural, social issues. That's not what they're there for. They're not there to decide one thing is approved of and one thing isn't in a political term at all. And so that was my experience of this whole thing. I also had some interesting feedback from secular gay people, gay friends and contacts, who say, we also stand with you, Richard. We do not want the gay movement to be hijacked by the transsexual lobby. And so it's absolutely your right to express your view, particularly when you were asked by the organisation concerned as to how you felt things were going within that, which I found quite interesting from a cultural viewpoint. So that was my experience. That's what I've been doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. There's a lot of things we can come back on that. Tamandra.
Mine definitely works. Here you go.
Oh, no, it's fine. Hello.
Let's just swap it.
Leeds. No, here we go. It's very nice to be back in the county of my birth. I was born in Castleford. Anyone in from Castleford? See, this is why I'm a lapsed comedian. Let's move on. So I am mainly going to talk about technology because somehow I have become somebody who writes about technology and the relationship between technology and society, rather to my own surprise. But I did just want to say maybe a couple of general things about the experiences we've just heard about, because I think one of my other interests is in how we disagree in society, and I think one of the very worrying trends we can hear is that there is less and less room to actually disagree. I mean, I also think we tend to do it very badly, that having this kind of civil discussion that we're having this evening is all too rare. But I also think that the idea that it's actually fine to really disagree with people, even on quite fundamental issues, and we can still live together and get on together and do business with each other, is an idea that needs defending in itself, which is kind of ridiculous, but here we are. But I am going to mainly talk about technology, and I'm going to particularly talk about, although I write very generally about how our data is collected and used to track us and survey us, both by private companies and also governmental authorities. In fact, it's quite hard to separate those two because often data is collected by companies and then used by governments and vice versa. But I'm particularly going to talk about digital ID, just because that's a thing that's very in the news at the moment. And the first thing I want to say is that it's easy sometimes to feel like there is a kind of top-down conspiracy and that authorities are amassing power because they really, really want to dictate every aspect of our lives to us. And I actually don't think that's true. I think it is much more what David was saying at the beginning, that it's not a would-be dictatorship, it's technocrats and bureaucrats saying, we just want things to run more easily and be more convenient and run more smoothly, and wouldn't it just make sense if we just had all the information in one place, and then, we would just know that this is the same person and they would be able to access government services really easily, and at the moment it's a mess, and just like very tidy-minded people that genuinely think things would just run more smoothly if you did that, and don't really think through the political consequences of things, and don't really think very much about the political sides of things, so perhaps it doesn't occur to them that people disagree with them. So in a way, I think it makes more sense to think about a lot of these initiatives as a nudge rather than a shove, that there's no pausing to think, oh, well, maybe actually it's all right for people to drive around. Maybe people drive around to do things that are quite important. That there's like having decided that driving around, I mean, for example, is a bad thing, that then it makes perfect sense to just use whatever tools you have to nudge people to drive around less. I know I've offended a cyclist already. So, for example, where I live in southeast London, they're giving us an extra tunnel because the Blackwall Tunnel is always congested. Or like, yeah, get an extra tunnel. And then they said, oh, but you're going to have to now pay for both tunnels if you use them. So we're basically going to be held hostage in southeast London because you have to pay for the Dartford crossing. The Woolwich ferry is going to be the only thing that's free. And they have said, we're going to charge for them, partly to pay for the new tunnel and partly because there's too much traffic. So we're just going to discourage people by charging them to do it. Right? Okay, so your answer to transport is to make it, is to nudge us to stop doing it, basically. Anyway, so back to digital ID. Right, okay, so little history. Digital ID, there's been repeated attempts to bring in ID cards. Apparently the first sign of British resistance to it was in 1951, where some guy took the government to court for asking for his, this is the post-war ID, still around, and he was stopped, asked for his papers, and went to court and said, this is not how we do things here, and you should not have the right to demand to see my papers, and that kind of laid down a right, which I'm sure David probably knows much more about. So there's been repeated efforts by the government to say, look, we're just going to bring ID cards because then it'll be much neater and we'll know who everybody is and where you all are, and people just wouldn't have it. So the digital ID thing is quite interesting, I think, because it's kind of coming in by the back door anyway, because the more things we do, the more ways we relate to the state through digital services and online and through computer systems, the more we, in effect, have a series of digital identities in all these systems. And a lot of people, for a long time in the government, for decades, have been saying, this is ridiculous. We have these separate databases. Why can't we have them all in one place? Why can't we just use the national insurance number, for example? And that will be linked to everything. And then everything will run more smoothly. And without even having a thought that this would be the kind of identity document that you might use. But of course, if you did bring that in, then that would in effect become a kind of identity document. So there's a very good article online by a professor called Paul Bernal, who has looked into this a lot, and he makes a very good distinction between two uses of identity. So there's the point where you want to prove who you are. So if I go and get a parcel, I want to go in and say, this is me, and so that's my parcel, so please give me my parcel. And the idea that someone can require you to prove who you are. So somebody can say, you must show me your ID if you want to go vote or walk down the street or get a job or rent a flat or whatever it is. Obviously, there are probably overlapping cases there where it's something that you want to do, but you don't have to do, but open a bank account, for example, and you show your ID. But I think this is a really useful distinction because this is the way that a unified ID system is sold, digital ID is sold, is that it's much more convenient if you can easily prove who you are when you want to prove who you are. But then, of course, it's also much easier to have something that someone can demand that you prove who you are, not for your purposes, but for their purposes. I think the voter ID thing is quite interesting from that point of view, because you could say, well, if you want to vote, you should be able to prove who you are so that no one can steal your vote, which hardly ever happens, at least. If it does happen, I think it's more likely to happen with postal votes. So I'm not sure how this is going to solve that. But of course, you can look at it the other way and say, well, voting is part of my right as a citizen. This is how I exercise my political power and democracy. And why should you require me to prove who I am in order for me to exercise my rights as a citizen? But what's actually happening, which I think is quite interesting, what has been happening over the past few years is not that the government has been saying we are going to bring in this unified digital ID database, but that they have been saying, look, people need digital identities in order to do things online. More and more stuff happens online. People need to prove who they are to do banking or to buy things or to interact with the government for their driving license and so on. But what we're going to do, instead of the government doing it, we're going to set up a system where private companies can do it, and we will just set a standard that they can adhere to so people know they can trust them. There are private companies, this has been happening for some time. I think young people who want to prove how old they are to buy drinks, for example, can get ID for that kind of purpose. And there are private providers who do that. So I think this is quite an interesting approach, because in practice, it will still lead to everybody having an ID which is biometric, so it's actually linked to your physical self. And once something is linked to you biometrically, it's really hard to unlink it, because you can't really change your fingerprint or your face as it's scanned by computers anyway. So once you're in that system, you are in that system. I sometimes give talks to people, like I was giving a talk to some school bursars and showing them there was a little fad in Scandinavia for people to insert microchips, RFID chips, in their hands and use them as ID. It's a very Scandinavian thing. And so it's like, instead of having your work pass or your travel card, you would have your RFID tag under the skin of your hand. And so you just scan your hand, and that would prove who you were. And so I said to these school bursars, who would mainly be complaining about how difficult the teachers were to organise, I said, would you like your teachers tagged like this so you could see them moving around? And they were like, yeah, that'd be great. Not entirely seriously. And I said, well, what about the kids? What about the school kids in your schools? You could tag all of them and then scan them moving around. And they rightly went, oh no, that would be really intrusive. No, that'd be terrible. What about privacy? And I said, okay, well, how many of you use the kids' fingerprints, for example, for them to pay for their lunches? And quite a lot of them did. I said, all right, well, when the kids leave your school, if you had a little tag under their hands, you could just take it out and that'd be it. But if you've got their fingerprints, that's that kid's fingerprints for the rest of that kid's life. Okay, have you really thought about the kind of sensitive data you've got here? So just because an ID is digital, if it's biometric, it is still very much linked to you. So I think I'm just going to finish off with a few of the problems with a kind of unified ID, if there was a government digital ID. But it's basically mission creep, because it might be convenient for bureaucrats to have one number that attaches to each of us. And they do already have this in Scandinavia. In Scandinavia, it's very normal. Norway and Sweden, everybody has a number, and everything they do with the state, from library books to healthcare to whatever, it's the one number. And generally, people seem to be very happy with that. Their relationship with the state is like, well, you give us lots of good services, and we have a number, and we're all fine with this. But there are advantages to not having one unified system in terms of our relationship with the state. There are advantages to the mess of having a different, like, driving license, passport, national insurance number, whatever. And one of them is that you can actually feel more trust. If you know what purposes this data is going to be used for, you can feel more trust that, like, well, I'm giving you this information and you're going to use it for that, and that's the deal. And if I don't want to give you that, I don't get a driving license, okay, fine, well, that was the deal. One interesting example of this is the census. In the year when the poll tax was brought in, looking at, I think some of you are also old enough to remember that, there was a lost million census entries. 1 million people disappeared from the census that year because 1 million people thought, well, you're just going to use this to chase me up if I don't want to pay the poll tax. And so people stopped filling the census in. And ever since then, the census has been really careful to say, look, we only use this information for the census, and we're not allowed by law to give out individual information about any individual for any other purpose. So please fill this in honestly, because we really want the big picture, we really want the population information, and if you don't fill it in, then we don't get that, and we can't, predict how many hospitals we need down the road, whatever. But that was a real case where people were being asked for information for one purpose and did not trust the government not to use it for something else. So having separate data sources actually is really important from that point of view. But the mission creep thing is also really important. And if you think about the REPA Act, which was meant to be about serious organised crime and terrorism, and allowed local authorities especially quite a lot of surveillance powers, and ended up being used to pursue people for letting their dogs crap around the place, and people who were lying about their address to get their kids into a different school, well, that's not really serious organised crime, is it? That's you give somebody power and they go, well, we've got it now, let's use it. And I'm going to actually finish off with a thought, which is also from Paul Bernal, where he says, the thing is, it's really not clear why you would need a unified government digital ID. It's not clear what purpose you would need it for. So it does start to look like a solution in search of a problem. And that made me think, well, what is the problem that it's a solution to then? And at best, I think the problem that it's a solution to is that they haven't really got a great sense of purpose. And so if you take on a huge technological, technocratic project, that starts to look like a purpose. And at worst, it suggests that they think that the problem is us. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Austin.
Right, hi. I just thought it'd be worthwhile, since we're talking about state power and state intrusion, just to kind of reflect on events in America in the last couple of days, where the entire armed forces of the FBI couldn't spot a nerd with a rifle climbing across the roof. And so it does suggest that maybe the state isn't as all-powerful as we might think. That I don't know if you remember that old maxim, military intelligence is a contradiction in terms. It might still hold true today. So even though democratic institutions, as we know, as a result of that, are clearly under threat these days, and I don't want to minimize concerns about that, but I want to put them in perspective a little bit. So hopefully, you can take it or leave it as what I've got to say. One thing we have to thank Richard Tice for, maybe many things, I don't know, but one of them from Reform UK is that he overturned a 25,000-seat majority of Matt Warman MP, who is the Minister for Digital Innovation. And his idea of innovation, by the way, is increasing online security. That's his big idea. And while they kind of sell it on the basis that online security is about stopping terrorists from plotting online or child porn or whatever it might be, that's the way it kind of is sold to us. But in reality, the Online Safety Act, which was the result of all this conversation, threatens personal liberty, personal privacy with an end-to-end encryption messaging. That's what they were planning on doing. So they can actually read any message that you put out there if they ask for it. So obviously they can't charge you with threatening behavior or problematic communication if they can't read your messages. So they now made it much easier for them to do that. So I lived in China for quite some time. And I think, as some people were saying, we kind of grew up knowing the difference between China and the West. China is authoritarian, we have free speech and tolerance, and they're a one-party state, and we have this wonderful democracy. So we weren't really convinced, I'm sure, when Chinese companies like Huawei, the phone company, when they said, don't worry, even if you give us entry into your telecommunication system, we won't hand over the data to the Chinese state, because we know that if the Chinese state asks for it, let me tell you, they're going to give it. But when you then look at Facebook in the West, or Meta under Nick Clegg, they actually handed over personal data to the American government, to the American police, to the British establishment, and they also had a non-disclosure act imposed upon them, so they can't actually talk about it. So it's probably even worse. But it's straight out of the Chinese playbook, you would have thought, except for the fact that China does it under duress. Chinese companies are forced to hand over information, whereas Facebook gave it voluntarily. Facebook closed down Donald Trump's Facebook page of their own volition. So I think we have to be a little bit kind of cautious about seeing authoritarians everywhere, because, well, they are, but it's in a different guise to maybe what we recognize. I don't know if you remember Neil Ferguson, good old Professor Neil Ferguson. He was very excited when he realized that we could lock down people like China did. But again, it's worth reminding that in China, the authoritarian one-party state, they responded to public protests in order to stop lockdown. So while we in all the democracies in the West were waiting to be told that we could go outside and lockdown was over, we were waiting to be informed that we could claim back our lives, China, people went on the street and forced the authorities to back down and forced the end of lockdown. So sometimes things aren't as black and white as we see them, and I want to look at maybe the reality of state monitoring, maybe through part of the prism of China. When I was driving with a friend of mine in a place called Suzhou, which is just outside Shanghai, he ran through a red light. And he must have been like within a split second, there was this ping on his phone, and they charged him the fine straight away through his bank account. And it's like, remarkable and wonderful and fascinating and appalling and atrocious at the same time. That's what technology is like. But during that lockdown, China really went to town on digitization, and everything now, if you go to China, is paid for by apps, mainly in the big cities. You can't get a taxi, you can't really buy a coffee or a beer or whatever without a mobile banking app. And so effectively, China became a cashless society. Yeah. But actually, what then happened after lockdown is that old people started complaining because they didn't have maybe mobile phones, so they didn't have access to it. Hotels that wanted to try to encourage tourists back into China started complaining. And actually that level of protest, that level of concern, made the authorities back down somewhat and have opened up some of those kind of banking systems and have put cash back in the system. So, sometimes political pressure works, is what I'm trying to say. And when I was in China just a couple of weeks ago in Shanghai, I had to register with a payment act. Forgive me, I had to get one. It took me about an hour to fill in the nonsense that they ask you for, all the information that they want. And the final page was this facial recognition camera app. And I held it in front of my face, and in Chinese it was saying, "Stop covering your mouth. Stop covering your chin." So this kind of major Chinese state authoritarian regime can't deal with a beard. So maybe we have less to worry about than we suspect. In terms of there's a new book out actually, which is called Sentinel State by Min Pei. It looks at how China actually controls such a huge country, which is no mean feat in its own terms. And he says that while there are kind of tough penalties, and we all know that they lock a lot of people up, there's also a trend for what he calls preventative repression. That's quite sexy, isn't it? Preventative repression. It's a bit like that Tom Cruise movie 20 years ago, Minority Report, like pre-crime and all that. So it's basically the idea that that China operates through a massive police state network. He says actually that's quite small, and what it relies on is low-tech, labor-intensive approaches. Low-tech, labor-intensive. That's the classic image maybe of Chinese apparatchik informants. Who are going to give information to the state when they see other people behaving badly. So I remind you of Mark Warman. Remember him? He's no longer an MP, but he was, at the time he got kicked out, was introducing something called vouching, where, quotes, suspicious individuals can be identified through trusted people within the community. Who are those trusted people? Well, the government says that they are dentists, doctors, accountants, amongst others. No wonder people are pulling their own teeth out. Well, you can apply. You can certainly apply. So all those people that you're supposed to trust are actually mandated to report on you through the system, become part of that kind of state machinery. Not that they do. Don't want to frighten you too much, but it's there to be done if need be. And that kind of monitoring that, in China and in the UK in different ways increases a suspicion of each other, which I think is really unhealthy, leads to greater social fragmentation rather than unification. So when we come to slightly less authoritarian measures, soft power, which obviously China is trying to do a lot, President Xi Jinping went to the Science Fiction Writers Guild a while ago, and he told them that science fiction, quotes, is a good vehicle for conveying the country's strength in science and technology. So go forth and write. Whereas, Western science fiction is thought to be miserable, dystopian, we're all going to die, we're all going to drown, the future is terrible. President Xi assumed that Chinese writers would be more positive about Chinese century. Actually, it hasn't worked out that way, because actually Chinese people are as miserable as us. But in the West, when you think about it, telling Western writers what to write by a politician goes against the whole ethos of what we expect of free expression. Over here, instead, we have what's called sensitivity readers. I don't know if you've come across those, yes? These are people who look for anything in a book that might cause offense. And I was reading recently, Anthony Horowitz, the children's author, very, very good author, was asked to take out the word scalpel from one of his books, scalpel. And that was because Native American readers might take offense. I'd work that one out for yourself. It's something to do with being scalped. Anyway, and also in an Essex library, they had to remove a children's book called The Three Monsters because one person complained that one of the monsters had said, "We don't want any funny foreigner types around here." So, and that book has been banned. So restrictions take many, many, many forms. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of liberal conversations that happen in China. Probably I've had more open, frank conversations in China with ordinary people than I have necessarily in this country. The basic point, I think, if I can round up, is that we kind of need a bit more nuance, if that's possible, a bit less paranoia. Technology is a tool, it's a very useful tool, it can help us connect, and we're right to be wary of it, but at the same time, we mustn't be conspiratorial. Technology can be used for good, I'm sure we all know this, but it can deny us access to money, but it can also set up possibilities for political mobilization and for political conversations. Certainly, millions of Chinese people are finding this out, right? They don't necessarily have the same freedoms of access and organization as we do, but they're using social media to find that out. Even if that ends up in them getting a low social credit score and refusing them the right to travel, they're finding many more creative ways to engage in political criticism because they think it's important. They think it's genuinely important. They think kind of democratic conversations are important. Hard to believe, but it's out there. Actually, wherever we are, when people come together with critical opinions, it's the social and political rights. That's where they won. In the engagement between people, the technology is almost secondary, or maybe a technology that can advance that, can help that, or can hold us back. But that's for us to decide, not for the technologists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you, everyone. I want to dig down a bit on this and ask a few questions because we've heard a range of reflections on this, but we know that the Bank of International Settlements, David, said that the good thing about central bank digital currency is you could monitor every single transaction. And we also know that the European Commission has got the Digital Services Act. In fact, recently we've seen this important declaration by Elon Musk saying that he's going to challenge it, and they tried to do these backroom deals, but people had to sign up to it. Much more egregious, actually, even than the Online Safety Act. And we've seen things like the truckers with GoFundMe and all of that, and Trudeau and bank, citizens' accounts being shut down. But I suppose my question to you is, because your point about discretion is really important, is there a rational way that we can harness the technology? Let's say, for instance, my mum just lost, the doctor said they lost her files twice for her medical report. Now you can do that, you can have a loss on digital as well, but is there a way that we can harness some of this technology for use in a way that doesn't make us Luddite, but we can make sure that we don't have overreach from the state? And just as a thought on this, everyone always commented on how Britain, and London in particular, but Britain was the most CCTV camera in the world up until recently, and yet we still have a big problem with crime. So how do these things all sit together from your point of view?
That's a great question, because you're on the wrong track if you think that the solution can be found in kind of legal or technical breaks or limits on the power of the state. Because if someone's determined to govern in such a way as to control your life, then they will find a way to do that. As I'm sure the human history teaches us nothing if not that. If someone is determined to be an authoritarian, then the law won't stop them from doing that. So there are things that we can do, but they have to exist in the realm of ideas rather than in the realm of kind of technical fixes. So you're absolutely right. We need to think about what are the appropriate limits on technology, and what are the appropriate limits on the way in which technology is being used. But that isn't a problem that's got a technical fix. The solution has to be in the heart. So that sounds about a corny way of putting it, but if I can go back to March 2020, that's the classic example of what I'm talking about. Politicians had a choice there, right? They could have done one thing or another. At that moment, it's the human decision maker. It's not just Boris Johnson, obviously, but he was the central figure. It was, what did he actually think? What was his instinct? Was his instinct towards freedom, or was his instinct towards its opposite, right? So we have to think about how is it that we get into a position where the people who are in positions of power are choosing to exercise that power in the appropriate way. We don't think about that at all, really, do we? I mean, that's just, it isn't something that's up for discussion in society, but it's a really, really prominent problem. It might be the prominent problem of the age, really. How do you get people into positions of authority who are going to use it wisely?
Well, and just following on from that, the question about authorities using it wisely and discretion, I mean, who decides? Should we allow it to be up to others, or should it be the citizens? I mean, Richard, you were posed with a question and you went back with another question, and it seemed like your line of inquiry was completely beyond the pale. I mean, it's funny because you seem such a calm, a reverend, and you think, oh, well, he's going to be like a bastion of society in many ways. Well, maybe the previous kind of society we were in, not the one that we live in now, where certain ideas are meant to be there, something and some are not. So this question it's again about discretion, but who's deciding what the new mores are? And is that, just from your own point of view, how do you see that? Do you think that's a political thing that is constantly there, a bit like free speech, the Constitution, but people have always fought over it and continue to? Or is there a way you can ever just get it dealt with once and for all and just say, we should have practical freedom, privacy should be sacrosanct, and is there a way to achieve that, or is it a constant struggle? How are you looking at it now, just from your own point of view?
Well, I was quite struck by actually what David said right at the beginning in his presentation about it depends so much on the character of the person behind the decision making. So whether it's the technocrat or the politician or the person working for Facebook, it's what character have they got? If they have been trained and brought up with a sort of left-leaning woke ideology, a sort of quasi-Marxist ideology, they will have a certain set of values that they want to impose and affect us by. So I would have thought, in one sense, you're right. Every age has got to fight for some basic fundamental rights. And obviously, in the Middle Ages, you were fighting physically, practically with the neighbouring nation for things as far as freedoms are concerned. So yes, we have to be re-educated, but it depends so much on the character of the people concerned. Which obviously, in my business in the church, that's a kind of fundamental. Where all the time we're dealing with human beings who we know will do better if they get in a relationship with God, because they'll start to have some new direction, they'll start to have a new set of ethics, they'll start to have a different set of values as to why they're here and how they're going to relate to their fellow citizens, hopefully in a positive way. So to me, that question of character, absolutely, we've got to teach better character, really, I think.
I want to explore that a bit more, but this question of character and then technocrats and Tamandra, you posed the question at the end, is the problem us? But you also talked about how the private sphere, like private companies rather, and the government are often intertwined now. We've seen that more and more with big data. The examples Austin gave about Meta, we've seen some fall over themselves to censor, impose things. These diversity, equality, and inclusion mandates that are there. Is it about character? Is it about having a strong set of principles that no matter who comes in with what ideas, it's a bit like the First Amendment in America, that is the barometer. No matter what ideas come in, whether they're conservative or woke, we have that there, so that has to be a reference point. In a practical sense, how do you see, is there a way that you can say, well, this is the way that we guard against it, without saying we want to limit technology? I mean, how do you get around that?
Okay, just a small question. I think, well, I mean, in some ways, on a practical level, it is a kind of, you're constantly trying to work out what is the trade-off, for example, between having medical records that are there when you need them and accepting that you're going to give up some personal privacy perhaps at some point in order for your medical records to be available and perhaps for them to be used for research. So you know, practically there are a lot of trade-offs, and the important thing really is that those are decisions that are made socially and that include us, and they're not just kind of happening over our heads. But I think David is right when he says this isn't a problem that you can solve technocratically, either through legal means or through like software, because there have been a lot of attempts to say, oh, we're going to use software. The original idea of blockchain was people who didn't trust central banks and had this great idea that if you wrote the right software, you could somehow liberate yourself from the state. If only it was that simple, really. But I think in terms of character, there are kind of two... it shouldn't come down to an individual being morally trustworthy, which is not to say that we shouldn't all have moral principles that we live by, but you cannot run the political system by just saying, well, everyone has to be good. You need to set up the society that you're living in such a way that we accept that everyone isn't good all the time, but you know, it will still work. And in one way, we need to, as I kind of said briefly, we need to get back to the idea that actually you can have a plurality of ideas and a plurality of principles that people live by and a plurality of moral values and somehow still get along together by tolerating disagreement and tolerating other people living by values that you really don't share, which is what Yorkshire Bank absolutely failed to do with you. But in another way, of course, that does assume that there are certain values that everyone is prepared to share, like democracy, freedom of speech, respect for difference, like real difference, not like diversity in a DEI sense, but actual profound difference of opinions and values about how to live. And so in one way, I'm inclined to say, look, we have to live with each other and tolerate each other's different points of view. But in another way, I want to say there are certain values that we really have to defend, and freedom of speech and expression and freedom of conscience and democracy are those core values. And none of those are going to be solved by technology. I mean, I called my book Technology is Not the Problem, because I think it's much too easy in this day and age to point and say, oh, look, it's the technology that's making us do it, or the technology that's preventing us do it, or the big tech companies and they're all powerful and they're psychologically manipulating us with their irresistible apps. But actually, we have to accept responsibility for ourselves and for living as human agents and running our own lives, but also as a society, we have to accept responsibility for having the arguments about how we want to live and what's the balance between everyone putting their health data into a big pool where it can also be used for life-saving research, and people saying, well, but this is extremely private and personal and sensitive information and I want to retain some control over it. And those are just discussions that we have to have as a democracy.
So I want to push that a bit more, because when now if you go into some shops, if you go and do your shopping, they just have there's a photo, so it's not even, it's biometrics on steroids. And also when you come into the country, now it's always been the case at borders we do things differently, right? But if you go to the States, for instance, all of the digital elements of your eyes, your face, your fingerprints, they're all that you have to, as 6 of the key cities, you have to do that just even to get in. And yet, we've got a situation where many things happen not in an analog world, right? It's not that this is to your point, and some of the things that I would like Austin to come on to Austin with about as well, which is, for instance, if you look at things like the cancelling of academics for being whistleblowers or for saying, I don't think we should prescribe children these drugs, or should we just ask ourselves some questions, or questions about the environment or lockdowns, or any of these issues that we know are things that you can get into trouble in your social sphere for. It wasn't technology that was doing those things, right? That was kind of a political battle. So are you saying that you think people have become too scared around the fears of digital ID, or do you think there are some real fundamental concerns with it? Do you think that it's more like it's in the analog world and we just have to fight all these things through on each count? Or is there a real significant concern around digital ID and the state having control of all these?
Oh yeah, no, I think there's a real concern, absolutely. What I mean by technology is not the problem, is that you can't look at the technology and think that the technology is doing things. Technology doesn't do anything. It's like humans and institutions do things, and the technology is just the how. No, I think there are real concerns with central digital ID. You know, even with the most optimistic view of what current governments want to do with it, and as I said, I think it's not that they want to be dictators and wield loads of power. It's just that they think fundamentally it's easier to nudge us into doing the things that they assume are the right things without any debate, and technology is one of the ways they can do that. So I genuinely think that a centralized digital ID would be a bad thing, and once you've handed over that kind of power of information, it's really, really hard to take it back. And even if you think this government is broadly benign, who knows what another future government will turn out to be. And you know, I mean, you know, we don't have to go back into history to look at the terrible examples to imagine that things could be misused. So I do think it's a problem, but it is a political problem. It's a problem where you have to say, you know what, having some privacy, having some independence from the state is a fundamentally good thing. There is no need for the state to know everything that we're up to, and there's no need for private companies to know everything that we're up to. And you really can't draw a hard line between the two. I mean, as Austin was saying, if Google or Meta know something about you and the state wants to know, they will know.
Thank you. And so, Austin, just it was interesting to hear you talking about the challenges in China. It's very difficult when you're not there, and even perhaps when you are there, but when you're seeing things either on social media or on the press here, whatever you're reading, and seeing what's really going on in China. But there's this impression that, like with the social credit system, a bit like Black Mirror, everyone's just getting all these credits or not, and they're all. And then you talk about these rights, and these rights, obviously, there were different rights that were happening beforehand as well, and the Chinese state has to think about how it's dealing with it. But to what extent? So just shed a bit more light on that, would you? Because it's just fascinating about what actually is happening in China. Because often we say, well, if you don't want to be like, we don't want to be like China, what's going on? I mean, obviously lots of people have become wealthy, lots of people have become affluent. What does it mean to are people free in China? It's a quick question. And then you posed it in the context of talking about Meta and what was going on here. But how much of these concerns do you think, in terms of the kind of cities, the future we want to see, 20-minute cities, smart cities they talk about, surveillance or expansion and dynamism, how much can you sort of separate these things out and sort of say, well, there's ways that we can do this, and how much should the public be involved in that? I suppose that's what I'm really getting to.
Flippin' heck, right. Well, it's like, China's funny, isn't it? I mean, it's basically, China says it's a democracy. Yeah. In the same way, when the Brexit election was happening, I remember that China allied itself with the European Union, in as much as they were saying, look, the European Union is a centralized authority, it makes certain rules, but then it passes it down the chain, right? And like, if you're in Leeds, you can make it work, right? They'll give you the mandate, but they'll give you the freedom to try and maybe work it out for yourself. And that's what we do in China, they say. Do you know what I mean? We're a centralized central party system. We come up with all the rules, we pass it down the chain, and if you're living in Xinjiang province or somewhere, you have to make it happen. So on that level, they say, what's there not to like, right? We're a democracy in the same way European Union are. They weren't very favorable to Brexit, as it happens, because that was a bit too much of an expression of self-interest. But when it does come to, see, the thing about China, I mean, I don't know why I'm really talking about China, but anyway, when it comes to China, one of the key things they want to try and do is to maintain the party, yes? So bugger the everything else. It's about maintaining the party. So they talk about a harmonious society. But it's all about how do you maintain the rule of the party, which actually will then maintain the next role of accumulation, or whatever the next role of industrialization. So whatever threatens the role of the party, therefore becomes a threat. So one of the classic examples was about, 10 years ago or something, where the Marxist Party in Beijing University started having meetings and started getting, started organizing people and having these out of university rallies. And that was too much independence for the Communist Party. So they shut them down and disbanded them. So the Marxist Party was basically ruled out of order by the Marxist Party. Because, so what's happening in China is, in terms of its development, is that it kind of lets out, it lets out the real for creativity and self-expression, because it needs that. It needs those kind of independent entrepreneurs to actually develop interesting business ideas, Alibaba and all these Tencent and all these kind of organizations, to try to bring some dynamism into Chinese economic life. But obviously, once they become too independent, once they become too, up their own backside, once they start criticizing the state for not giving them enough freedom to take money, then they start getting clamped down. And you see that with a lot of people. I mean, Jack Ma from Alibaba was actually locked up, disappeared. Well, let's just say he disappeared for like 8 months and reprogrammed, so he didn't do it again. So there's a freedom in China until you go too far. Yes. Now, whether you could say that about this country, I don't really know, because it's not exactly the same. So we are literally on other sides of the world. We're literally poles apart, and we see democracy and the way we organize society completely differently. So I think that it's a very difficult one to compare and contrast. All I'm trying to say is that actually, when we slag off China for being authoritarian, very often the people saying it miss the fact that it's much closer to home that we should be worried about.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of the speakers, and then I want to see indications. If you want to speak, we're going to have volunteers at the front. You can come up and they'll hold the mics for you, so you can start making your way up. We're going to ask each of you, coming back this way, so you keep the mic, Austin. Is it possible to challenge the concerns, to prevent the concerns around central bank digital currency, but also about programmable currency and digital ID, in a quick way, whilst getting the benefits of technology? Your thoughts on that, and is it possible, and how we would do that? Just quick thoughts, and then we're going to go out.
I think we overhype digital ID.
Okay.
It's not happening.
Thank you.
Well, I agree. I think a government probably won't impose a central digital ID, although they might have a unified number for administrative purposes. But what there is private digital ID providers. So that maybe that will be enough mess to leave us to swim in between the different providers and retain an element of privacy. But I think the really important thing is that the technology can be useful, but to challenge the purposes that it's for, and maintain the principle that it is fine to want some privacy from oversight, that we should not expect everything we do to be accountable to somebody else. And if, the old, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Well, I always say, if you've got nothing to hide, you haven't really lived.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm quite positive, actually. I think absolutely we can push back and take back control. It's a question of unity. And if enough people kick up a fuss, enough people say, no, we have a private life, it's not for the state to intrude on banking, on financial, on information technology and so on, I think it can work. But we have to stand together in it. That's why you're such a good organization, actually. The more of us that speak up, the more pushback there is. I was mentioning that what Austin said early on about how even in China, when it came to the lockdowns, the people said enough. And the government did actually respond and let them out of it, whereas we didn't do that.
Well, some of us did.
Yeah, I'm sure you did.
Put your hand up if you're in the audience and you challenged lockdowns and you're on the demos and doing all of that. Well done. We all did that. Yeah, good stuff. Thank you, David.
Yeah, well, I'm more pessimistic, but I'm kind of optimistic in the long term because the simple fact of it should be evident to anybody, but it seems like human beings are condemned to kind of repeat the same mistakes. Technocracy, authoritarianism, social control don't work because they actually make people miserable, but they actually also don't fulfill the promise that they make. So they never actually make conditions better either. So as government becomes more and more technocratic and more controlling, it will make everybody miserable and it'll make things worse. And that means eventually there'll be a kickback. That just happens over and over again throughout human history, and that's what will happen, I am sure, with digital IDs and central bank digital currencies. They'll be introduced, but because they're solutions in search of a problem, they won't work. They'll be disastrous. Yeah. Governments can't actually. I mean, we couldn't build HS2 for heaven's sake. The idea that we can also, completely change the currency system and introduce a digital ID that will have no problems or glitches. Forget about it. Ain't going to happen. So our incompetence will save us.
Yeah. Well, so if Shirley and Paul can come down with the mics, please. You're going to have the mics either side. If Paul's coming down on this side, or if you one come over this side and one over here. Here we go. We'll give that to Paul. Thank you. And one of the key tenets of Together is that it is in that word together that we have already challenged things and we've pushed back. And the more of us that do that, the more likely we're going to see what we want to have happen. And that self-fulfilling prophecy that it's inevitable, they're always going to do it, it's all part of a plan, or they're too big and controlling, and whether we think it's because it's happening in Davos or the WEF or the WHO, or whether we think we just got technocratic authoritarians here who are weak, or both. The thing that we've recognised is that when we stand together here and fight back and get more people engaged and say this is what we want and we demand, we can have an impact. That might be around net zero and having the discussion about the consequences for working people around the country, it might be about privacy and freedom of speech. On each of these areas, we can form new allies, and it's an interesting time. We've got a new set of people in Parliament, a lot of them, but some of them in Labour have challenged digital IDs. I mean, you might not like some of them, you might love some of them. Diane Abbott and others have all said they're against digital ID. I think that there's interesting ways that we can choose on some of these issues to work with people, to discuss these things, thrash them out, and be vigilant about our concerns. But also to make sure that we really resuscitate the idea of the principles around this, around our freedoms, around privacy, around the ability to be able to do and say, the rights of association without being penalised by financial institutions or others. But that needs conversations around all sorts of things like EDI and like ESG and that kind of thing. And that means having these really difficult conversations and being brave. So, who would like to speak? It will be a first. If you come on up, put your hands and come up. You're going to come and speak here. Remember, you're going to be on camera, so if you don't want to do that, don't do that. Our volunteers are going to hold, Shirley and Paul are going to hold the mic, and you can come down this side if you want to. We'll do a round. There can be questions and points, and come on up if you want to say something, because this is your chance to do it, and then we'll take a round and we'll go back to you guys. Yeah, you can say who you are if you want to.
Yeah, it's all right. I won't say who I am, but just quickly, all the solutions that you're looking for are actually already here. So, for example, in our Constitution, and also we have the Bill of Rights, but it's just the knowledge of these things, because what they've done in education is diluted it so badly and twisted it that people don't know what's right and what's wrong anymore. But if you look back at the law, for example, Statutes Monopoly 1623, it says that there's no corporations or political bodies have any authority whatsoever. Literally, because corporations are corpse entities, they're dead, and political parties are public servants. Even if you're a judge, you're a civil servant. They have no authority over us whatsoever. And Halsbury's law says there is no authority for administrative courts in this country, and no act can be passed to legitimise them. And Bill of Rights, for example, no fines or forfeitures without conviction from a jury of peers. They've got no right to fine you whatsoever, but people don't know how to handle it. But the reason people don't stand up to these things that they are forcing on us is because of the economic influence they have through the banking system. But again, I'm trying to explain this to people. So, for example, a promise is not a contract. So therefore, you cannot enforce a promise. So therefore, you cannot securitize a promise, which means a promissory note is securities fraud. So that's the first thing we should be challenging them on. But because there hasn't been an alternative until now, nobody's done it. And also, when you hand your currency into the bank, they depose you of it, they take it off you. Not only have you handed securities fraud in because there is no value backing it whatsoever, you've actually shot yourself in the foot, because what they will do is inflate what you've given them 9 times, called fractional reserve banking. So what you've actually done is diluted your nothing, and you've ended up with even less than you had to start with. Or literally all it is knowledge. So if you guys want to speak to, I spent the last 5 years going down this rabbit hole, discovering everything. So if you want to come and speak to me afterwards, let me know.
Hi, I just wanted to ask just 2 words I noticed from everyone except the father. Were incompetency and conspiracy. Well, you mentioned not so much incompetency, but a sort of a natural authoritarian personality in bureaucrats. And I just wonder, to what extent do you think conspiracy is quite a legitimate understanding of why things are centralised in this way? And I don't belong to a religion, but my inclination is are there satanic forces behind things? And I don't care how crazy I sound there. That's my inclination.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just, on the first, David, if you will, and if keep coming up if you want to speak. We're going to come back to the panel and come back out. On the first gentleman, he made that point, and these promissory notes and securitisation. How much is it true that if you just assert that it's not true, it's not true? And that your point about the proceeds of crime acts, well, I'm also concerned that obviously there is terrorism, but when we start redefining certain behaviour, like a protest, as potential terrorists, and all that type of things happening, you alluded to it. So how much is it the case that the state doesn't really have any control and power, and the monetary authorities, and it's actually, you can just reflect this back to them?
No, well, to answer that, so there's a way of coming back to my original point, really, your discussion of the Proceeds of Crime Act. So the Proceeds of Crime Act was created in order to prevent, effectively to discourage money laundering, right? So the idea is, if people know that they're, if they launder money, then there is a seizure power that the state has. The money can simply be confiscated, it can be forfeited, then that will discourage money laundering. It has a deterrent effect, right? So that's basically the idea behind the Proceeds of Crime Act. But of course, once you've created the law then, that gives the discretion to the enforcement authorities to interpret the law in such a way as suits their purposes. And all of a sudden, as Tamandra was pointing out, being bureaucrats, fundamentally, they start thinking to themselves, well, what other problems can we solve? What can we use this power for? And it just so happens that there's a lockdown. I mean, to kind of transfer the example to Canada, because the exact same kind of anti-money laundering rules effectively exist in Canada. We have a lockdown, we have this trucker protest, we've got these emergency powers that allow us to freeze bank accounts and forth. So the existence of the law itself creates this, it grants this power, it creates this opportunity. So that's the problem that we confront really when it comes to law, is that law never in itself, it's never the case that you can simply look at a legal rule and say, well, it says X, so therefore X happens. And it doesn't say Y, so therefore Y doesn't happen. That's not how it works. Law is open to interpretation because human language is open to interpretation. Opportunities present themselves, and as long as the law has created a zone of discretion to allow an enforcement authority to interpret it as they see fit, if it grants them discretion, they'll use it to solve what they see to be problems, like, for example, the trucker protest in Canada or whatever else it might be, So that's the real problem, is that we need to find a way to actually reduce the presence of law in society. The rule of law is contingent on a minimalist approach to to law rather than the creation of a kind of proliferation of rules.
And also, if you would, you made the point about the Energy Act 2023, and a lot of people are concerned about things like electronic digital meters, and they just can be switched off or not. How do you see all of that? Do you see that it's a plan for that to happen? What's your take on it?
Well, so the gentleman was talking about conspiracy, and it's sometimes it's hard to address the topic of conspiracy, because as soon as you even mention the word, then you instantly identify you're a nutter, right? There's no getting away from that. But there are times when you do think there is genuinely something very suspicious going on. But that Energy Act 2023. The fact that they've created this legislative framework, it's very, very clear, you know. We have the power to force you to have an energy smart device, right? Or to convert your non-energy smart device into an energy smart device. We have the power to ban the sale of non-energy smart devices. And we have the power to license regulators to regulate the flow of electricity into energy smart devices. So it's more or less pretty clear what the idea behind that is, right? That at some point in the future, they want to control the flow of electricity into household appliances through the internet. The legal framework is there for that to happen. Why do they want to do that? Well, in the preamble to the Act, it says one of the purposes of the Act is to facilitate the achievements of net zero. So it's not a conspiracy when it's right there in the text of the Act, you know. So yeah, sometimes governance happens kind of by accident. Sometimes it happens because there's a benign purpose. Sometimes it happens because there's a kind of just by mistake or kind of, you know, through incompetence. And sometimes there are actually conspiracies. So discerning which of those a given thing is at any particular time is hard. But, you know, I don't want to create the impression that nothing is ever intentional, because that would be a mistake to think that too. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard, so what ended up happening with the Yorkshire Building Society, but also more to the point, like, how do you see your relationship now in that sphere with financial organisations, and has speaking up and out about it? You said that, like, out of 200 journalists and others, only 2 disagreed with you, so you obviously got a lot of...
Yeah, no, they weren't journalists. That was 200... This is working again. That was 200 bits of correspondence. It wasn't journalists. I had lots of journalists, true. Is that one? I know, it's gone off again. Sorry about that. No, that was 200 people giving correspondence. It wasn't journalists. I had about 15 journalists. Yeah, I'm definitely more sceptical about the whole banking thing. I go out of my way to use cash wherever possible, which I never used to do, to try and, you know, facilitate that, ensure we can have a cash in your pocket. So yes, much more sceptical about how they're operating it, and obviously abroad in other countries, and they've tried to go for a full cashless society. I think that's potentially very sinister. I mean, obviously, maybe very convenient for all of them, but it gets back to the character thing. You only need to have somebody in charge who's of a bad character and controlling and wants power and is going to persecute people who don't agree with them. And then you've got, remember the Germans in 1930s in Hitler's Germany, the first thing they went for was control the financial system. And they said all the way through, for your safety, for your safety. That was their retort. We are going to make sure that all the banks, basically they squeeze out the unsafe elements. So you can't be a communist, you can't be a Jew, you can't, if you're a shopkeeper, a Jewish shopkeeper, you can't have banking, simple as that. So it depends on the character of the values of the person concerned who is making these kind of decisions. As we've been hearing, technology in a sense is neutral, morally neutral. It's what's going on in the human heart that is the issue.
Although you would argue that in Germany they had quite a lot of things happening before them trying to take over the state like that, so there was a big political struggle. And
That's all together, yeah.
Interesting. Samandra, this question that the state and our financial organisations, we can just reject them. Two things come to mind quickly. One is that we just had dispersal units for the Euros in Trafalgar Square, which meant fans couldn't be there, right? So we've had all sorts of protests in London around the country. I personally I think you should have protests. I think there is a difference between certain things we've seen and protests when you start damaging buildings and things like that, but we already had laws to prevent that. And I recently was swept up in something called a Section 6, where they just had dispersal units around a demo. As it happens, it was one of the Gaza, Hamas, Israel demos, and the police just decided that we were, I think all it really amounted to was a few white guys in a pub, and they thought we must be something to be concerned about, and they just said it's a dispersal rule and we're just going to like hold you and lock you down basically here. The reason I mention that is this idea that it's in thin air, this idea of the state and or financial institutions, and really we can just reject it. How much do you think that's true or not, and how, you know, when we've got these issues in place, or any other reflections? But I was minded of that when the guy made the contribution.
Well, I mean, I guess I really don't know. Excuse me. I don't know a lot of law, but I have lived in the world for quite a long time, and it strikes me as a difference between saying, well, theoretically this law doesn't apply, and trying to have an argument with a policeman on a street, especially if it's a kind of slightly lively event like a demo. And yeah, sometimes maybe you can end up in court and argue a case, but you're still in court. And at some point, and this is where I think the blockchain people went wrong, when they said, no, we can do this with software. At some point, there becomes an element of physical coercion in the power of the state. And sometimes we want that, you know, if someone burgles your house or whatever, or threatens to come and break your windows, then you might be glad to call on the coercive power of the state to actually do something about crime. And then when you have fundamental freedoms, like the freedom to protest, you say, well, no, there should be limits on the power of the state because we should be able to protest. So, I think it's all very well to argue in theory that because of some ancient law we have the right to do this. But if the police come and arrest you and take you up in court, you're going to spend a long time arguing your case, and you may lose because the institutions of the law exist, and there they are. It's like you can argue against capitalism and say, no, this is a wrong system because you're expropriating the surplus value of my labour. But you're not necessarily going to get any more money for your job by doing that because we're well inside a system that exists. But if I could just come back to the conspiracy thing, because I think that's a very useful and interesting question. And I'm starting to feel that, like misinformation, which is a really unhelpful word, because as soon as you say something's misinformation, you've made a moral judgment about whether it should be trusted or not, instead of engaging with it and trying to argue, actually, I don't think this is true, or I think this is framed in an unhelpful way, or whatever your objection to it is. I'm actually starting to think that conspiracy is another one of those words, because as soon as you say something's a conspiracy, you are saying, you are paranoid and there's nothing to worry about here. Whereas a lot of the things that perhaps people in this room, me, myself included, are worried about are things that have been quietly introduced or are being quietly introduced without public democratic discussion. Often because the people who want to introduce them think, well, if we have a public discussion about this, a lot of people won't like it, but we know better, so we're going to bring it in. Now, you can call that a conspiracy, or you can just say, there's a lot of very undemocratic measures being brought in to nudge us to do things or to prevent us from doing things, because it's assumed that whoever is doing this and whoever has some kind of bureaucratic or power, or maybe technological power, knows better than we do what we ought to be doing. And that's why I think that the transport initiatives, or rather maybe the anti-transport initiatives, hit such a nerve, because the freedom to just be able to move around is quite a fundamental freedom. And it's all very well to say, well, you can move around, get a bicycle, but for lots of people, this is not a practical solution and will only get you so far, literally, physically, geographically. And the fact that the measures to nudge us out of cars and onto bicycles on our feet have been brought through without democratic discussion. You know, you don't have to call that a conspiracy, but I think you can rightly say it's anti-democratic. And we should actually talk about what we want to do about transparency.
Shall I crack on? Well, I'm going to look at the conspiracy point as well, because I quite liked the conspiracy people that were out and being slagged off as being conspiratorial. Because for me, especially during COVID itself, it was very much an example of people trying to work out what the hell was going on, rather than just being sold a line. And in some ways, it became conspiratorial because many people couldn't actually believe what really was happening. And they were hoping that it was something more conspiratorial than the truth of the fact that things were out of control. So I thought mainly most conspiratorial people were actually quite sensible thinkers. Which was not the way it's been portrayed. But as somebody said, that there is this conversation, you know, like instead of saying left-wing people or right-wing people, we now say far left and far right. And there's a new book out called Centrism, which is this kind of new mandate from the powers that be, who are actually trying to marginalize opinion with which they disagree and kind of put it out into the margins and say that actually only central consensual discussion is going to be legitimate and approved of. And you know where that is. I mean, apart from the fact it's Lib Dems with more MPs, it's also the fact that it's going to be a very mainstream established position that we're going to have to concur with, which I find really problematic. The second thing is on terms of laws, in my opinion, since I mentioned Brexit and European Union, I broke the barrier and said it, is that since that time, you know, where the British government was always relying on blaming the European Union for the problems, and then when Brexit happened, it had to look to itself to actually be part of the solution and didn't have any clues. In some ways, the courts have now taken on that role. And you can now see kind of laws and courts and judges who are seen to be this kind of arbiter of impartiality. And the politicians are saying, don't blame me. You know, the courts have decided. It's the law. And so you now have this welter of legislation from nowhere. You turn on the TV for the Lords or the Commons, you can see thousands of pieces of legislation going through where none really is necessary, or where existing laws would do the trick, like stopping XR protesters from in the street. There's plenty of laws to stop that happening, or people sitting in front of cars and stopping the traffic. There's many, many laws doing that, but they want to have an industry of legislation behind which they can fall to say it's not us, there's a legislative process, it's impartial, and if you disagree with that, then you are in some ways some anarcho-syndicalist who's actually trying to overthrow the system, because, you know, that's where real stability lies. Let me just quickly say one final point, if you don't mind, in terms of this debanking thing, since I've obviously avoided it. But I did read, and this may go against the grain of everything that's held dear in this room, but I read the Financial Conduct Authority report, which said, let me get to the end of the sentence before you boo me. It said, ideologically motivated account closures are vanishingly rare. Not a single account was closed because of customers' political views in 2021-22. What they're actually saying is, and it's not a proud boast, they're saying that if they have reason to believe that there's financial misconduct, for example, then the cost of doing the inquiry and finding that out is so extortionate that they'd rather close your account and not bother. And that's the tendency of what they're doing. Thousands of people, I mean hundreds of thousands of people are having their bank accounts. I think it was 350,000 people last year had their accounts closed down because they couldn't be asked to check it out.
First of all, on conspiracy theories, anybody here a spoiler alerter? Because I don't, conspiracy theory, I've heard that phrase certainly over the last 5 years. I lived in the Middle East for 20 years, and I didn't hear it there. I didn't hear it until the CIA invented that phrase, conspiracy theorist. And they invented it for a purpose, and that was to put down people that they objected to. And so that it's a bit like the Zionists can call somebody anti-Semitic. They're throwing things at people that are, let's face it, getting them all into one place and then seeing how I can put them down. In terms of the banks closing accounts, they're going to close a lot more this year than they did last year and the year before. And next year, they're going to close a lot more still. Our banking system is going to be digitalized. For all those people who used a credit card to park, I had to phone my business partner who's with me. I had to phone my business partner because two things. One is I hate using a credit card. And for all of the, if you go into a shop and what they should say to you is, would you like to use cash or surveillance? There are 38 countries that are signed up to share every single bit of data that they can have on you. Go to shop at Tesco's or buy petrol, and if you use a card, they will have that information. 38 countries have that information on you. By that one piece of information, they know what you've bought, they know where you've bought it, they know your shopping habit, and that sounds kind of almost benign, but they know your date of birth, where you live, who you spend time with, how you got there, what vehicle you used to get there, how much you spent on fuel. We are being led down a road that is almost impossible to get back from. And we've heard people here, and with huge respect, we've heard people here talk about things almost in a benign way, that if we can influence our politicians surely don't mean us harm. Our politicians are owned by people outside of the political sphere. Our politicians, I know Keir Starmer. I used to hire Keir Starmer. I ran a company at one point called Just Legal Training, where we specialised in anti-terrorism and covert policing. And he was, ironically, one of the top lawyers in the country in human rights. I cannot believe that his name and human rights get put into the same sentence. His dad owned a company within which they did tool making. We all know what he said on TV when he was asked the question, Westminster or Davos, which did he choose instantly? Davos, not a heartbeat in between his words that he used there. We are not being governed, we are being indoctrinated by people who, I'd like to think that they're really intelligent. Some of our politicians have no intelligence whatsoever, and we are being led by them. They are being led by others who are manipulating them, and we are being manipulated by outside forces. The WEF was mentioned. The WEF, the World Health Organization, the CDC in the States, the FDA. All of these are interfering with every single person's life in this room at this moment in time. And we have no say over that. We have no say over the direction of travel of the WHO. We think we do not. As soon as Starmer decides that he's going to sign that agreement with the WHO, which is coming fast, all of our rights as a country are gone, because the WHO will override everything, as they did when they lied, when they declared a pandemic, which wasn't a pandemic, it was an epidemic, but they changed the phrasing of it when they were approached by Bill Gates within 3 weeks of calling an epidemic, and Bill Gates told them to change it to a pandemic. And pandemic... And by making it a pandemic, all of the laws that we're supposed to be governed by went out the window, because then they could bring in a form of martial law, which is exactly what they did. And that martial law is still in place this day, because if they declare, which they could by blaming something like bird flu, let's name something else that isn't real, and if they do declare that in the next 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, and they say lockdown, can I have a show of hands who you know, or do you know people that will lock down, that will wear face masks, that will queue up for a jab in their arm. We haven't changed. And yet we've got to do, I'm Irish, I'm from Dublin, and what we've got to do maybe is look to Ireland for some lessons. And the lessons that are going on this week, they're not accepting some of the things that are being imposed on them, and they're taken to the streets. I think we need to take to the streets.
We've got one more person. Does anyone... Suzanne as well, yeah. If anyone else wants to come up, please do now, because we're going to be then going back to the panel and we're going to be wrapping up, and I'm going to say a few words. So if you do want to speak, we've got a little less time now, so you don't have to just ask a question, you can make a point, but try and make it quite fast, please. So yes, the gentleman there, and then Suzanne, and then there.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking of making one point, but during the conversation, I thought there's another point I'd like to throw in first, and it relates to net zero. I work for an automotive company, won't mention the name, but they're very into net zero, and I'm gradually telling my colleagues more and more that I drive a renewable fueled vehicle. And they ask what that fuel is, and I say, well, it's diesel. I've recently discovered the work of Thomas Gold, who is an astrophysicist who worked with Fred Hoyle, worked on radar during the war. Very interesting guy, but he was looking into I think one of the moons of Jupiter. Its atmosphere is mainly methane. And people say that, well, methane's created from rotted animal and plant material. Well, that suggests there was life on the moon of Jupiter. Basically, what his hypothesis, and this is backed up by Ukrainian and Russian scientists, and going back to Dmitry Mendeleev, who put together the periodic table, that hydrocarbons are generated by the Earth. They're abundant. They only come through the crust where the crust's been damaged by meteorites or explosions or large damage volcanic effect and so on. So, yeah, I had great fun talking to a family member who's a net zero zealot. He was saying that, well, of course, but we've got to do something because the oil's going to run out because it's finite. So this was before I'd read a lot of this stuff. I said, well, that's a big assumption you're making there. Took the wind right out of his sails. But that argument, it's a diversion. He can't answer the whole thing about net zero and the purpose of it. So he's just using a sneaky tactic to say, well, of course, the oil's going to run out. Anyway, that's so Thomas Gold, look him up, the Deep Hot Biosphere, I think his book is. The other thing I was going to say was I've recently, thinking of the David, the first speaker, was saying that we've basically got to hope that the character of our leaders is good, and I mean, there's no chance of that, let's face it. I recently I listened to James Corbett's podcast a lot, and I recently heard he reviewed a book by a guy called Larkin Rose, which is called The Most Dangerous Superstition. It's basically saying that all of the problems that we have are because we've bought into this myth of authority, that groups of people can have authority over us. And there's no moral reason for that. He's basically saying that if you work on the principle that you don't harm other people, you protect yourself if you're attacked, the basic simple rules like that, how can the government have the authority to basically steal your money in the form of tax under threat of, imprisonment or violence being inflicted? We don't have the right to do that to other people. So how can a group of people, other group of people, give themselves the right to do that? They don't. They have no right to do that. So anyway, I would recommend looking into Larkin Rose, the Most Dangerous Superstition. It's a very good book. Yeah. Okay.
Can I also ask Cameron Parry to come down? Cameron Parry from Tally. So after Suzanne is going to address the audience.
Thank you very much, and it's been very interesting listening to you all, so thank you. My question is, well, I've been involved with an organisation called UK Citizen for about 2.5 years, and some more latterly with StopNetZero.org. Funnily enough, we're not getting much traction on the social media with that particular name, but so two questions really. How do we get out there with our Stop Net Zero? It's so important. We were at a conference, Climb 24, with a number of people, just talking to the delegates there, and they were surprised. There was one guy I was speaking to. He was surprised that they hadn't had any pushback against the net zero agenda. So how do we get out there? How do we get our sort of purpose? I'll put some cards down on the table at the end. So that was my first question. And my second question is, has Together ever thought about launching a campaign to get some kind of household budgets from the government on how much they're spending? That actually is simple for us to understand, not cloak and dagger. You know, how much do they take in tax? How much do they actually spend? And particularly in relation to net zero, where we seem to have endless amounts of money to chuck at things.
I'm gonna ask Cameron Parry to address this. Just before you do, I just want to note for the sum up things that, to your point, Austin, it is true the Financial Conduct Authority said that very, very few banks got closed down as politically exposed persons, but 343,000 accounts have been shut. Which has gone up from 47,000 in 2017 to 2021-22, using this financial laundering, like not sure situation, as well as banks shutting and ATMs closing. So, is it cock up or conspiracy, or is it just that there's an attempt to reorganise things, or is it that something is actually going on? It's a question for us all in that context, right? Just to think about. But now, Cameron Parry.
Thanks, Alan. Hello, everyone. I've been a Together member since late 2022. So I think, have you got your 3rd anniversary coming up in September? So I've been there for about 2/3 of it. Sorry for getting here late. But also, I'm the founder of Tally Money, which is an alternative monetary system. It's not a cryptocurrency. It's something I developed to give people a chance or independence from the banking system and the devaluation that goes on with the pound, which is all we have to choose from in a bank account. So I'm an entrepreneur. The issues that we're talking about are really important, and there's been some great topics raised and comments, but we need to be armed with something. I mean, it's, otherwise we just leave here worried. And so what I set out to do was create an everyday account, but denominate it in something that you control, that belongs to you, but it works just like your pounds account works. It's perfectly legal. Anyway, and it's called Tally Money. So every tally is a milligram of gold, and when you do an electronic funds transfer into your Tally Money account, enter your sort code and account number, it becomes Tally, just like any other foreign currency that you might rely on. When you make payments, you get a debit card, you can send money back out to your bank account. It turns up just as it does with pounds and what you're used to there. But the benefits of that money is, one, you know how it derives its value, and your bank is not meddling with it. It is your direct ownership of a physical asset. So the value of gold compared to pounds moves up and down, dips and rises, but it goes up over time. And just as an example of that, the gold price has risen against the pound at over 10% per annum, year on year, since the start of the century. So for the last 24 odd years. It's gone up a lot since we came off a gold standard in 71. And actually, for all of our living memory, really, we're living in a bit of a conceptual currency. I think a couple other people have mentioned that it's not anchored to something, it's not actually there, it's a debit and credit. And as far as technology goes, digitally, most money is created, and that's what you're actually seeing in your account. Only 3% of the money supply is ever printed or minted. So we're already digital. As far as digital ID goes, you know, we use passwords. We use these things so we can access money and have the convenience of payments, and that's all good stuff. But we can use technology to our advantage, to give us independence. There are some positives about CBDCs, not many, but I'm certainly sure the politicians haven't thought of it. But there are actually some positives to us as citizens if some of that is implemented. It's a deeper conversation, but nevertheless, there are pros and cons to everything. But we can use technology to give ourselves independence of money, where we're in control of our earnings after tax, after we get our pay, that you're not then suffering from inflation, which is really a stealth tax, and it's devaluation by design, and the devaluation is meant to be at 2%, but you'll notice that prices go up a lot more than that, and that is the real cost of the devaluation of the money that you put with the bank. So that's a bad system. It doesn't work for the people. And when the public sector doesn't serve the public properly anymore, it's actually, in my view, up to the private sector to come up with the solutions and fill those gaps. And that's what we've done at Tally Money. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, I've left some these little business card sized brochures on the table back there, or you can come and speak to me about it. But yeah, we just wanted to, there are solutions. You know, Tally's sort of the first one. It may not be for everyone, but it works. It's been around for a few years now. We've got thousands of customers, so it's not some flash in the pan thing. You know, technology is, I think somebody said, technology doesn't care, really. It doesn't have a moral value, but it can be used by people for good or bad. And so we can design good products that actually suit the consumer, that serve the consumer, rather than serving the financial institution that allows you the convenience of payments, which is how the banking system works. So anyway, that's Tally Money, but really happy to be personally, and also as a company, we're a member of the business community of Together, but very pleased and proud of that. And yeah, it's fantastic to be at another event listening to these very serious topics. But we do, there are some solutions out there. We have one, I'm sure others will follow, and that's what we need. We need to be armed with some tools to have our independence.
So do speak to Cameron at the back afterwards before you go. So we're going to come back to the panel. And just to say, David, that we have a digital yuan. There's a big discussion about new regional blocks. There's a discussion about the digital dollar. You were talking about the digital pound. The guys were saying it's not going to happen with digital ID, but we've got it in Europe and we've got it in many states in America. In America, you have ID much more regularly, and you also have a lot of freedom, right? So maybe you can have that alongside one another. Where do you see this going now? How much can we do to shape the direction of it? Programmable or not, our influence, our control or not? Some people think it's just a complete reset that's going to happen, and that's the intention. They're going to like reset the whole financial situation as well as the farming and everything, and that's a plan. How do you see this situation, the landscape? 2 minutes for everyone. It's just a thought about where we're going. I know it's an impossible task. We'll carry on talking afterwards.
Yeah. Can I be sort of slightly annoying and come at the question from a different angle? And try to speak in a slightly different way. So ever since March 2020, well, let me rephrase that. I'll come at it from a different angle still. We just had a general election campaign in which, I mean, a lockdown basically, I mean, I never heard it mentioned that the lockdowns had even happened, right, during that general election campaign. And that whole era has kind of gone down this collective memory hole, it seems, that everyone's just keen to forget about it. But that event was such an important break in the relationship, I think, between government and the people, that I'm not really sure that it can recover from. Regardless of what people thought about COVID and whether they thought lockdowns were a good idea or not, I I think more or less everybody gradually got the sense that they were being lied to some degree or other, right? There was just this kind of real breakdown of a loss of faith in what was being said, and ever since then, I think people have been casting around. It's almost as though we've had this kind of collective mental breakdown where we're just kind of like wondering what's actually going on here. Like, who are these people who are telling us what to do? Like, why does the state even exist? You know, who put these people in this position of authority? And that's led us to us going down all kinds of different rabbit holes and becoming interested in all kinds of questions that might be called conspiracy theories or whatever it might be. But I think and that means that everything gets cast in this kind of very distrustful aspect, right? And central bank digital currencies are just going to be another example of that. Maybe if 20 or 30 years ago, if the idea of a digital pound had been mooted, people might have thought, well, that sounds, I could see some benefit to that. Because there are some benefits that have been kind of put forward by the Bank of England. But because of what has happened in recent years, I think people just are naturally they want to kick back against it. So I think my feeling is that we're heading for a real kind of fundamental breakdown of trust between government and society, such that the things that government wants to do are going to be resisted more and more. And I think that leads to a very bad place. I don't think that the central bank digital currency issue is obviously an important one, and certainly there is going to be a digital pound, make no mistake about that, but whether people will use it is another matter. And I think that's what we can, certainly if I'm thinking about kind of pushback on what we can do about these sorts of issues, I think just simply not using the digital pound, using cash where possible, but just resisting with your apathy, if I can use that phrase. There's an old line in an REM song: withdrawal in disgust is not the same thing as apathy. Withdrawal in disgust sends a political message as well. Refusing to just partake in the system, I think will kind of like have its effect too. So yeah, that's kind of the position I'm in at the moment, thinking about those issues.
This is probably not the take on it you're expecting, but I would like to just express, as a Christian, I have a larger, sort of overarching view that actually, two things really. One, that God is actually in charge of human history. And secondly, that human history is coming to a denouement. This has been the Christian understanding for 2,000 years, is that at the end of the age, there will be a major financial crash globally. At the same time that all happens, actually there'll be a major turning globally to God, because people will be so desperate, and they'll think, well, how have I been living my life under my own devices, and it's all gone horribly wrong? And at that moment, actually, is when there's the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, this is the biblical narrative. So where are we going from here? I don't know. It may be another 1,000 years, but it may be 20 years. It may be 5 years before. I do believe there's a difficult time financially coming, but I have actually lots of hope, because I do believe that the Lord God is still supreme, even through our folly and our trauma as human beings.
Very quickly, well, follow that, as I say. In terms of is it a cock-up or conspiracy, I think it's just simply bureaucracy. I work in a university, I think you do as well, David, and it's there's 67% of the people who work in universities are admin staff, and the faculty are an afterthought, and it's run by idiots. And you can't actually. There's been, Foucault's written a lot about bureaucracies, and he has he's spot on in some respects that it's very difficult to kind of, once you're in it, to tackle it, to challenge it, rather than maybe stand outside it. And for me, that's probably the most important thing to do in events like this. If I had this conversation in a university, nobody would have come because it would have been cancelled, and B, it would have been maybe preaching to one or two converted. Whereas I think this is a much more open, frank conversation forum. So I think that's one thing. In the same way as like I was trying to say before, that governments or or authorities on every level in civic forums are reliant on NGOs now rather than themselves taking decisions. They're looking to Stonewalls or critical race activists or wherever it might be, third-party agencies to really kind of be the ones that they can outsource responsibility to, so they don't have to take the blame themselves. So that's a real problem, I think, structurally in society. Very quickly, if I can, on the net zero point. Obviously, the part about net zero is not necessarily the thing itself. It's the idea that humans are a problem. You know, if nature comes first, humans come a very poor second. So it's a very Malthusian agenda that we eat too much, we travel too much, we do too much, we breathe too much. So I think that there's a couple of things which I think you could focus on. One is the arguments, really trying to point out to those people who are into the environment, really, if they follow their own logic, should be celebrating austerity, which is around the corner, because we won't be able to travel so much, so therefore surely they should be joyous. I won't be, but I think that's one thing we can really stick it to them on. Second one is the heat pump thing, which is coming back with a vengeance, this extortionate nonsense of heating your home with a heat pump and having to redo all of your radiators and pipework for £20,000 to save 150 a year. Third one, is the developing world, which I think, pointing to the developing world and the lack of development and the fact that if net zero really kicks in, these people are going to stay underdeveloped for the rest of their days. And I mean, when you look today and see the poverty that exists, not just in this country, which is bad enough, but the squalor that exists in the third world in this day and age is unbearable. And I think that the idea that... Thanks. I'll give you money later. It's more the fact that there's a movement, an environmental movement, which suggests that you should maybe pay people not to develop so that they actually don't despoil the natural world. So I think that's always a good one to use. And the final one is one I saw online earlier today, which is that there were about 4 protesters who stood outside Greenpeace's headquarters and poured coal all over their front entrance. So, maybe we can use some of the tactics against them that they've been using us for a long time. Thanks.
A big round of applause for the speakers, please, and to yourselves. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Samandra. Sorry.
Well, I will be brief. I think you've put it very, very well, Austin. I think it's not an either-or between is it a conspiracy or is the government benign. I think it's a mistake to say that the things that are imposed undemocratically are because of one central evil conspiracy. It's really comforting to think that the world is run by some evil cabal, because it's comforting to think that it's run at all. It's not run. It's absolute chaos. And the real problem we have is that the people with power don't have any ideas, and they don't have any principles, and they do whatever seems best at the time. And the reason they don't want to have to argue for them is they don't trust us, and they also know that they can't really argue for the things they're doing because they're not based on any principle. And even the lockdown, which seems like a complete totalitarian power-seizing act, which in a way it was, but it didn't happen because they went, great, we've been waiting for ages for an excuse to keep everyone in their homes. It happened because they had no clue what to do. There was a disease happening. Everyone was expecting them to do something. They didn't know what to do because there wasn't really much they could do. They had a plan which said, carry on as usual and accept lots of people are going to die. And people didn't want that. And then other people started pointing at Italy and going, well, they're locked down. Why aren't we locked down? And in the end, they went, all right, let's have a lockdown. So I think it's a...
No more shouting from the floor, please.
So I think the thing is, what we have at the top is an absolute vacuum of principles combined with incidental power, some of which comes from technology and data and the ability to close down bank accounts and so on. And that's why we need to argue against these things from principle. We need to say, actually, you may not have principles, but we have principles. And principles we're defending are things like privacy and freedom, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, democracy, accountability, not of us to you in power, but of you people in power to us, because we voted you there. And that's why there are a lot of practical things, there are little practical fights we can have, but we're not going to win them unless we can argue from principle.
Thank you very much. I would invite you all to stay for a drink and chat with us, but I just want a couple of reflections. One is that I mentioned William Tyndall earlier on, and the courage of people that would actually stand up and be heretical at the cost of death and their persecution. And really, we stand on the shoulders of many of them, people who fought in the Second World War, but people who've gone back in history, like the Chartists and others, and all sorts of people who've dared to challenge, dared to question. And as Kant said, question, dare to question everything. We should do that. And also, we should recognize we've had some real victories. We've had some real successes. In the last couple of years, we've seen all sorts of areas kick out low traffic neighborhoods. We've seen people push back against egregious measures. We've all lobbied the Bank of England, as I said, about cash. We've had our voices heard, and there's much further we need to go. But in the end, and this is to the conversation about the WEF and WHO, it wasn't any of those organizations that locked us down. It was our own government using the Public Order Act, which is still intact. And if we want to stop the kind of measures, these very weak authoritarians, they're very weak, but they're technocratic. If we want to get some control, if we want to be the curators of our society and our future, we need to get organized. We need to convince our neighbors. We need to have arguments and not call people names, but believe in the convictions of our own arguments around freedom and privacy and rights. We need to get them involved with us and together. And we need to organize, we need to lobby, we need to do articles in the press, we need to write, we need to do whatever we can, give out leaflets, get involved. And this is what my invitation is to everyone watching and everyone here who's not doing that. Join as a member and get involved. Let's make our voice resoundingly heard. You know, up the road or down the road, Thomas Fairfax was actually born. Thomas Fairfax that led the Revolutionary War against the old monarchists and for parliamentarians. People have put themselves on the line and at a major cost. And I do think it's important to call things by their name as well, and we can disagree. Together, on our steering group and on our board, we disagree about a lot of things. But it is important to call things names. At certain points, someone may well be a conspiracist, whatever that might mean. The problem is it's been used to smear almost anyone who asks any questions, right? And it's like saying everyone's got mental health issues. What it does is it degrades the reality when people generally do and they need help, and it tries to present everyone as being at risk. And what we need to do is sharpen up our tools, engage with people who we don't agree with, be able to demonstrate our capacity to do that with our common fellow citizens and try and win them to us. Because whether you're secular or religious, we can live in sort of the best of times and the worst of times, the lightness and dark at the same time. And in the end, it's going to be up to us to decide what we do on this moving train and how much we shape it. So I'd invite you all to get involved. I want to thank everyone at the venue. Thank you, Cara, Shirley, Rose, and everyone. And also a big shout out to Comedy Unleashed, who are going to be back here in Leeds again. Do you want to say anything about that, Shirley, briefly? Yes, good. Right. So I'm going to hand you over to Shirley and Cara, and thank you very much. Please stay and have a drink, and thank you for joining us at home. Remember, we're stronger, we're better, always together.
My name's Shirley. I started the Leeds Together group. I used to be a pharmacist. I was, at the time in 2020, the health and safety officer in the hospital. And within a couple of months was in absolute despair as what was going on and what was being done. And the amount of lies that we have been told is just off the scale. We have a local group. We meet about once a month. The next meeting's the 25th of July at the Cardigan Centre. It does go on the Together website, but we also have a local email group. So if you want to put your name on our local group, we have discussions about all sorts of things. We welcome discussion. That's the only way we're going to move forward is through discussion. And I have to disagree with Tamandra. I think that most of the things that are coming from the UN goals. The 2030 goals, we signed up to the UN. You only have to look at what the Sustainable Development Goals are. Everything is driven through that. And so we knew that even if we got a change of government, because we're signed up to those global initiatives, we really are not going to see them do anything different at the moment. So we really have to keep pushing back. So yeah, we also try and be positive as well. We try and look for things that we can actually do instead of just sitting around and moaning about it, because that's not going to get us anywhere. And then we go sometimes to Comedy Unleashed. So it's come and say hello, come and speak to some of the people. Suzanne's Net Zero, we've got the speaker who spoke first, and the part we have the local boards. We do lots of things. Yeah, so the email sheet is at the desk. If you just would like to be on the email sheet, put yourself down. Yeah.
Thanks, Shirley. So I'm Cara. I came along a while ago to help Shirley run the Leeds local group. So yeah, just going back to the Comedy Unleashed, they helped us massively to publicise the night. I recognise a lot of faces, so I'm sure a lot of you do know about the Comedy Unleashed events. The next one is actually going to take place on Friday, the 6th of September, because they're taking a break during August. Andy from Comedy Unleashed, he just gave me a few words to say, make sure I get it right. Obviously, some of you must know it. It's somewhere we can all get together once a month to have a really fun night amongst friends. It is the first Friday of every month, so skipping it during August, and it takes place at the Hi-Fi Club here in Leeds. You'll find details online. It's a fantastic night. I do recognise a lot of faces from there, so please do come down. Come and chat to me or Shirley this evening. We'd love to get you involved in the local group and just to meet you. It's been brilliant to have you here. So we'll hopefully see you at either Comedy Unleashed in September or next week at our local meetup. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Final thing, there's some donation boxes. We love cash, but we've also got a little credit card machine. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay behind, let's have a chat. And remember, we're always stronger together. Thank you.